how is draft day going to go? Who wields the power? Who has say-so? Who has opinions that are going to be weighed and measured, but not necessarily just blatantly followed? How does it go in Eagles War Room on draft night?
Yeah, well, I think Howie's ultimately going to make the final decision. He's going to rely on the scouting department, and I don't anticipate Nick Sirianni having much of a say. I think they get some input from their coaching staff, but I would venture to say Jeffrey Lurie, and he shouldn't have input. No owner should have input. He may have as much input on this draft as the Eagles coaching staff, and that's never a good thing for a new organization.
You're checking out Birds 365 here on the JAKIB Media Network and on PhillyVoice.com. Mac guys, Jody McDonald and John McMullen, welcoming in our guest for the day. He's been covering the Eagles for years now for the Associated Press. Good to see he's got the AP backdrop going, and he's got some seriously good product in the hair. Yeah. Stick up big time in comparison to the Mac guys here.
By the way, we had Joe Santaluquito on yesterday. We had Ed Kratz on. So, Rob, you're the first guy on this show with hair. So, congratulations.
This is what it looks like when I just wake up. And I just slept on it, man. It's some good stuff. It's for sure.
It's as John points out, better than the people that you're on with right now. Don't be making fun of your own hair. We're quite jealous. All right, Rob, how has your off season been? I haven't talked to you.
Man, is there an off season anymore? There really isn't, right? NFL is like the show, 365, 24/7, constantly busy. There's whether even in the pandemic year, I found last year that it was even busier because you're always looking for different angles, different stories, different ideas, different things to do. So it's I'm ready to go, get ready for this draft, and we're still a little bit 2 weeks out.
So, Rob, obviously the biggest news this offseason for the Eagles was the shift from Carson Wentz to trade out to Indianapolis and Jalen Hurts taking over as the quarterback here in Philadelphia. You were on top of that story from the beginning, have a very close relationship with Carson Wentz and just the relationship between Carson, Doug Peterson, and the Eagles organization, that three-pronged effect. I know there's been a lot of disinformation. Just kind of run that down and how you think everything sort of unfolded.
I think one of the biggest pieces of misinformation was the relationship between Doug and Carson being sour, which I didn't think it was. Doug himself told me a couple times after the season that there really was no issues with Carson Wentz. And that was, I think, blown up a little bit out of proportion. And it appeared when Doug was let go, there were some people who, I think even Troy Aikman said it in a show with on a podcast with Michael Irvin, that it came down to Doug or Carson, which it didn't. But I think that it was portrayed that way. It was either Doug or Carson. And once Doug was fired, that Carson had won this power struggle. There was no power struggle. And we've come to find out, Doug said that to me. He said it to John Clark, I think, on John's podcast a couple weeks back, that there really were no issues between him and Carson Wentz. So that was one piece of misinformation of so many guys. And there's so many narratives that are pushed out there, so many different things that are driven. And I think most of the talking comes out of the NovaCare building, because Carson never said anything on the record to anybody. He didn't really say anything off the record. He just didn't speak. He didn't want to talk to anybody. He wanted to go away, think about his future, let the team come to a determination. And I think the team, there was a lot of mixed feelings. There were some people who thought, hey, we're paying this guy a lot of money. Let's try and fix him. Let's see what we can do to fix him. We're paying him a lot of money. We invested a lot in him. Let's see what we can do. Then there were some thought that, hey, we're in a rebuilding stage. Jalen Hurts showed that he's a guy who's worthy of a stronger look, a deeper look. maybe we go in that direction and use Carson as draft capital. When Carson makes it clear that he would prefer a fresh start, I think that's what laid the foundation for, all right, let's go in that direction. Let's trade Carson, and let's think about building around Jalen Hurts. But at the same time, the Eagles, the way they value the quarterback position, they're just not going to sit there and say, all right, here, Jalen Hurts, it's your team. They considered trading up, and I know they did, and I know that was reported a couple of weeks back. They looked at it, they thought about it, they investigated the possibilities, but ultimately they traded back, in which that means it looks like now they're unofficially committing to Jalen. You bring in Joe Flacco, I don't think anybody really thinks he's going to compete for the starting job, but they're going to give Jalen Hurts an opportunity to be the starting quarterback, and I think that's what they need to do.
Rob, you mentioned all the narratives that were out there and all the information that was out there from the time the season ended up until when Carson was traded. You rightfully point out that Carson wasn't the guy who was saying these things on the record or off the record, but some pretty good reporters were saying sources close to Carson Wentz, according to my sources, and you could read between the lines and know that it was someone who was in Carson Wentz's inner circle who was getting information out there? Or do you think reporters were just throwing stuff at the wall or making stuff up? Was Carson Wentz, well, you're right, he individually didn't get into the muck and the mire. His people certainly were putting their side of the story out. At least that's the way I read it. You had a good relationship with Carson. How involved were his people in putting the narrative together during this offseason?
Not at all. Not at all. And Jody, I don't believe we had reports that said people close to Carson. Most of the reports that were out there in regards to Carson Wentz and the Eagles situation were very vague in how they were, the terminology and the wording was. So his people were not speaking on his behalf. They were not going out there and pushing this. I think it was clear between the conversations from the Eagles front office and Carson's, when we say people, his agents, and I believe Howie Roseman actually referenced his agent Ryan Tolner a couple times after initially saying his agent, and said, "Yeah, I should mention him by name." They had the conversations, made it clear, hey, he would prefer a fresh start. Never at any point did he demand a trade. Hey, trade me or I'm not coming back. Trade me or I'm going to hold out. I'm going to sit at home. I'm going to take my football and run with it. No, it never reached that point. So the Eagles knew if there was not a trade that was going to come down that would be in the best interest of the franchise. And I think getting a 3 and a potential 1 at this stage of where Carson Wentz was coming off the season that he had, as terrible as it was, that was the best you could do. But I think the Eagles felt that if they weren't going to get anything like that, if it was 2 2s, if it was a 3 and a 4, they didn't have to make the move because they knew that this is a guy who would come in, who would honor his contract, who would compete, who would do the right things, say the right things, and all that stuff. It didn't happen. They got the trade done with the Indianapolis Colts, and they're able to move forward from there. But there's a lot of conversations that get started based on what we think, what's been reported that isn't necessarily accurate. And I have seen since December where speculation has become all of a sudden turned into actual fact, where if someone says, I think this player may want this, all of a sudden those words are put into the player's mouth. And I think we're treading on dangerous ground here because we really have to consider where information is coming from. And the Eagles are really good, guys. The Eagles are really good at controlling the narrative. The Eagles are really good at pushing out a story the way they want it to be spun. They do a terrific job at it. And if they could only draft that well, this team would be a Super Bowl contender year in and year out.
Yeah, Rob is correct about that. And you mentioned moving forward. This team is moving forward. And Rob, you brought up potentially trading up. The thought is around the league that the Eagles would like Zach Wilson. That was probably always unlikely. But once San Francisco moved up to number 3, there was sort of a firewall between any potential of that. And obviously, Jody's team of the Jets is going to take him anyway at number 2. But So the move back and the ship towards Jalen Hurts. Now, when you look back to last season, and I often joke about, I bring up emotional intelligence because Jeffrey Lurie coined it. I think there was a lack of emotional intelligence when you draft Jalen Hurts at 53 with Carson Wentz under contract. Did the Eagles overcorrect that and say, we can't mess with Jalen Hurts' psyche the way we mess with Carson Wentz's, and perhaps we should look in a different direction because of that?
I think there may have been a little bit to that, John. I think there was. They looked at the situation, and obviously Carson Wentz's unraveling, his undoing in Philadelphia began the night the Eagles drafted Jalen Hurts with the 53rd pick in the second round instead of bringing in a player at a position of need. And we all saw how that transpired. And I think there was a little bit of a learning process there. If we're going to find out what Jalen Hurts is, let's not push him by bringing in someone else, even if it's in a backup situation. Like, I know Washington acted quickly and brought in Ryan Fitzpatrick. But if you brought Fitzmagic here to Philadelphia, there's going to be a faction of people who say, hey, he should be a starting quarterback. He should at least compete. I don't think anybody's saying that in regards to Joe Flacco coming off of what he's done the past couple seasons. So I think the Eagles may have looked at it in terms of that, and that's good use of the term there, emotional intelligence, John. I like that.
All right, let me use the term you just used, Rob, competition. I was surprised that Carson Wentz blanched at competition coming into this next year. I thought that Doug Peterson was well within his rights to replace him when he did. As big a Carson Wentz fan and backer as I was, Carson was having a god-awful year, and the Eagles needed to do something to jumpstart the team, so they went to their backup quarterback, who's now their starting quarterback. I didn't think Carson Wentz should have had an issue with it. What he said in his Indianapolis press gathering tells you he was ready to move on from the day that he was replaced. He was thinking about, well, maybe Philadelphia isn't the place for me. If he's as competitive as he likes to say he is, which he also said in his Indianapolis press conference, why wouldn't he want to stay here and compete in Philadelphia?
He also said in that news conference that there were points later in the season and after the season where he thought about what might happen and we could work it out here. I've heard a lot of people harping on that part of it where he said, the first time that I thought this might not be it is the Green Bay game. But there was also, and I don't know if it was in that news conference or the next day when he spoke to Pat McAfee, where he talked about, it took time after the season to think about it. And there was thought that maybe we do work this situation out. I don't think Carson Wentz was afraid of competition, but I don't know a situation where you bring his time here was up for a lot of reasons. And part of those reasons have been reported, and part of those things have not been reported and haven't been talked about. And it's not for me to discuss, but there's been a lot of things that have happened behind the scenes that made this situation very unworkable. And when you reach that point of unworkability, when there's a lack of trust between the franchise quarterback and the front office, for reasons beyond what is obvious. Oh, they drafted a quarterback in the second round less than 2 years after giving him. No, when there's a lack of trust between a franchise player and the front office, that relationship is over. It's over. There's no way you can fix that. And I think that there's been other situations now that we're starting to find out a little bit about, where there are some issues with the front office, the way they handle certain situations and certain players. And that can reach that boiling over point where if you don't have trust in any relationship, if you go out there and you're running around and you're cheating on your wife or you're doing anything like that, that relationship is going to end up in a divorce. And I think the Eagles ended up in a divorce here because this was a relationship that dissolved because of lack of trust, not because of a competition issue.
Well, that's interesting. You bring up lack of trust, Rob. And I think, we all talk about Carson Wentz for obvious reasons, but there's another player that's still here, good friend of Carson Wentz and Zach Ertz. I think we all expected that to have ended by now, but it still pushes forward. Howie has mentioned sometimes you got to be the bad cop in these types of situations. The Eagles want value. But I go back to that Seattle playoff game, and I say to myself, Zach Ertz shouldn't have played in that game. He had the lacerated kidney, he had the broken ribs, and I think there was a lack of trust with the organization. He said to himself, I went out and did this. You guys are not sort of returning the favor. Is there any way this lack of trust can be repaired when it comes to Zach Ertz? Or is he out the door, just a matter of when?
I think he's out the door, and it's just a matter of when. I'd be very surprised, and I've had some conversations with some people close to the situation where there's a lot of bitterness, and I think they view it like this, that the Eagles have been loyal to people in the organization, to players who have done far less or given less of themselves than Zach Ertz. But all of a sudden, they're drawing this hardline stance with a guy who has been that loyal soldier, as you alluded to, played with a lacerated kidney. They don't win the Super Bowl, not just without his touchdown catch, but without the 4th-and-1 catch that gets them to continue that drive. Zach Ertz has given of himself to the community. He's done everything. He's been the consummate professional, the ultimate teammate. And I think that there's a feeling of that hasn't been reciprocated. And the situation has reached a point where some are thinking that the Eagles are handling this not as a business, but more as a little bit of a grudge with Zach Ertz. And that's not any way to do business. And I think, John, it's a matter of time. I anticipate probably maybe even right at draft day, it could be one of those, here's Zach Ertz and a pick, and you move up X amount of spots or whatever. It's crazy to think right now that Zach Ertz, as good as he was, is it worth that high of a pick, what the Eagles are looking for? I was told that they were looking for at least a 3rd-round pick, that they haven't been able to get at least a 3rd-round pick, that they haven't even entertained anything that's not a 3rd-round pick. Well, at some point, they're going to have to entertain and even accept it.
Understood. Rob Maaddi here with us on Birds 365. I do want to get back to Carson for just one more question, Rob. You mentioned that it wasn't necessarily a competition thing as to why the Eagles and Carson went their separate ways, that, yes, sometimes relationships just get so strained that divorce is inevitable and it ends up happening. That's what happened between these two parties. You mentioned there were several reasons for it, some of which you couldn't say. Can you give me one? Was there one reason, one example, one aspect of the relationship between the quarterback and the organization that you can point to and say, because of this helped to put the wedge between these two parties? Or are we just going to have to accept well, believe me when I tell you there were reasons why?
Jody, I can tell you this. So when the narrative is spun a certain way, in which after, I believe it was the Arizona game. So it was the Arizona game. Carson Wentz, Jalen Hurts had played against the Saints, led the Eagles to victory. Carson hasn't said anything to anybody at this point, hasn't made a decision, hasn't come to any conclusions about his future. Yeah, the thoughts come through his mind. Oh, this could be it. I might be done. What's going to happen? I don't know. All of a sudden, on ESPN, it's reported, and not through any fault of his doing, but Adam Schefter says that if Carson Wentz is going to be a backup quarterback, he may want to be traded. Those were Adam's exact words. That's not a report. That's Adam speculating. Hey, if Carson's going to be a backup, he may want to be traded. All of a sudden, that got turned into, that day on the airwaves, everywhere else, that got turned into Carson Wentz is backstabbing Jalen Hurts, sabotaging the team on game day, leaking information to ESPN that he wants out of Philadelphia. Never came from him. Never came from anybody close to him. Adam himself afterwards said, I didn't speak to Carson. I didn't speak to his agent. This is what I believe to be true, which was true. Of course, nobody wants to be a backup quarterback, but that was a conversation that many believe was with the Eagles front office.
Eagle generated, right.
Yeah, when you see the front office pushing a story, pushing a narrative that paints you as one, Carson versus Doug. No, it's not Carson versus Doug. It's Carson doesn't want to be here. Carson doesn't want to compete. When you see that being driven, I think that contributes to a lack of trust because you're not saying anything, your people aren't saying anything, but people are talking about you to push a narrative that betters their situation and makes them look better. And ultimately, I think that contributes to where we ended up.
And, Rob, who's got to pick up this mess? Nick Sirianni. So I do got to get your thoughts on Nick Sirianni. And obviously, you mentioned the pandemic. It's difficult in this environment to forge relationships and get a feel for these guys until we get back in the building, hopefully at some point. But nonetheless, what are your early thoughts on Nick Sirianni? Is he up to this? Is it possible to even know at this point, or is this just a wait and see situation?
Man, I don't know, right? Like, we don't know what Nick Sirianni could be. We've seen his energy. We've seen his enthusiasm.
Let's talk some ball, Rob. Let's talk some ball.
We've seen his excitement. He's got all of that. Is that going to translate as a head football coach? I've heard the criticism, and I think it's a little bit unfair. People equating him to being a rah-rah type high school football coach. Let's see what he could do when he goes out there. He's had some success with 3 different quarterbacks, right, in Indianapolis over the past 3 seasons, and I want to see what he can do with a young team, with a guy like Jalen Hurts, where there are there's no contract situation. There's nothing like that. They're not beholden to anybody. Let's go out there and let's try and build a winning culture again. And I'm actually excited to see, and I think, John, you and I spoke about this on my show over the weekend. Nick Sirianni, as you had mentioned, he's got a wide receiver background. This team's invested in wide receivers. That's why they traded out at 6, is because they didn't want a wide receiver at 6. They've invested in Jalen Reagor. They've drafted J.J. Arcega-Whiteside in the 2nd round. We know who they passed up to get both players. They've even invested in later rounds in Hightower and Quez Watkins. And I'm excited to see what can he do to maximize their talent, because perhaps the Eagles probably don't go in that direction in the 1st round again this year at number 12. More likely to go offensive line or defensive line or something that the fans don't want, because it's not going to be a sexy pick. But can he get some of these wide receivers to live up to their potential? So that's something that I'm excited to see if he could do it. And until we get to go out there and see him, I don't know what it's going to be like this year with the OTAs and training camp and all that stuff and how much we get to interact and see guys on the field. But I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt for now.
Appreciate your giving just around the fringes speculation as to what the Eagles are going to do with their first pick at number 12 in the 1st round. But before we get there, there has to be a plan in place as to how you determine who that player is going to be. We know what the relationship was between Howie and Doug, all the way back to Chip and Howie having the power, then not having the power, then getting it back when Chip got pushed out. Whole new coaching staff. Jeff Lurie may be more involved during the offseason than we've seen in previous years. He's always been involved, maybe more involved this year. How does the conversation go in draft night and the war room? I know it's a tougher question than usual because you haven't been able to build up a relationship with Nick Sirianni. We're all living in the virtual world these days, and he hasn't really coached a game yet this year. But I'm asking for the best Rob Maaddi speculation. How is draft day going to go? Who wields the power? Who has say-so? Who has opinions that are going to be weighed and measured, but not necessarily just blatantly followed? How does it go in Eagles war room on draft night?
Yeah, well, I think Howie's ultimately going to make the final decision. He's going to rely on the scouting department, and I don't anticipate Nick Sirianni having much of a say. I think they get some input from their coaching staff, but I would venture to say Jeffrey Lurie, and he shouldn't have input. No owner should have input. He may have as much input on this draft as the Eagles coaching staff, and that's never a good thing for a new organization.
Yeah, well, Rob, you bring up Jeffrey Lurie, and I do have to get your thought process because he does seem, you've been around this team for a very long time. Certainly to the outside looking in, he seems to have gotten more involved post Chip Kelly. I've also seen other people saying, you know what? He was always involved. Andy Reid was just a better politician steering him in the proper direction. So do we need a coach like Andy Reid who's savvy enough to steer Jeffrey Lurie away from his more, shall we say, difficult devices and difficult decision making? Because look, one guy I'd like to bring up is Carson Walsh, because the fans didn't like him. The fans wanted him out. And Jeffrey Lurie kind of made that decision. Okay, Mike Rowe and Carson Walsh aren't going to be back. Doug wanted him back. Why is Jeffrey Lurie getting involved in the weeds with assistant position coaches? Is this too much?
It's a business, right? And it's a business. He's the one signing the checks. He's the one, obviously, with the final say, and he's got all the power. And I think he runs his business sometimes to that degree where he hears the fan base. He hears the fan base. He understands what's going on. The Eagles don't need to sell tickets. The Eagles are going to be sold out regardless, right? So it's not like having to sign up Bryce Harper so you can get fans in the seats. And the Phillies signed Bryce Harper more for the business aspect of it. Of course, he's a great player. But from this standpoint, I think when you look at an offense that after 2 years in regards to Walsh and Mike Rowe had declined a little bit, and Doug's got a lot of loyalty, right? And I reported this after the season. They wanted to fire Frank Reich in 2016, and Doug pounded the table to keep Frank Reich, and that ended up working out in their favor. Well, Doug wanted to do it again that year with Walsh and Rowe. Didn't happen. Wanted to do it this year, and it didn't happen. And ultimately, he was the one to be let go. But I think Jeffrey Lurie might be a little bit reactionary, right? And is also an untrained eye when it comes to looking at talent. And as you alluded to, Andy Reid was really good at steering him in the right direction. Andy Reid was excellent at that. I don't think Doug Peterson certainly didn't have that Andy Reid quality, right? And Nick Sirianni, to me, I don't know at this point where he falls in line between Andy Reid, Chip Kelly, and Doug Peterson. That's going to determine a lot of this team's future success. Is how they can. You're not going to fire the owner. So how can you allow him to think he's got a lot of input and have say while at the same time not caving into his demands or his pressure?
Rob, you mentioned that you think Howie Roseman is going to have final say. A lot of cooks in the kitchen on draft night, but the chef that's going to hand in the card to the commissioner eventually is going to be Howie Roseman, and I agree with that. Eagles have 11 draft picks. It's a pretty big number. A bunch of them in day 3, but it's still it's equity that you can have to move around with. Howie's already made one trade this offseason, dropping down from 6 to 12. We could debate the merits, the pluses and the minuses of that, but however you weigh that one, that's already in the books. How much faith do you have in Howie being the best Monty Hall that he can be on draft day? If it's going to come down to wheeling and dealing, moving up, moving down, results in on the players that Howie had picked over the years, not necessarily great. How is Howie in a making draft day deals mode? Do you think he's got, we know he's got chips to play with this year. Is he going to be able to turn it into a big enough stack?
I have more confidence and faith in Howie and his ability to be able to take a pick and turn it into more picks, or take a couple picks and better the situation, than I do in Howie actually executing that draft pick. So to me, Howie is great at wheeling and dealing. Howie is terrific at that aspect of his job. He could turn a pick and trade up, trade back, do whatever it is, but then it ultimately comes down to executing on that pick. And that's where I don't think any of us at this point have a lot of faith in Howie Roseman. You look at the 7-year track record since 2014, the only Pro Bowler that they drafted isn't here anymore.
Well, Rob, we know that track record, and I know I was on your show this weekend, and I mentioned if you look at the top half of the draft in the history of this Eagles organization, it says quarterback, offensive line, defensive line. So if I put you on the spot at number 12 overall, Howie Roseman stays, they hand in the card. What are we looking at?
I don't think they're going to stay. I really think there's going to be a move. But if they do stay at 12, It's really like you and I discussed this weekend. It's probably going to be in the trenches, somebody along the defensive line or somebody along the offensive line. I think the prospects at 12, whether it's Slater or someone else, might fall in line with an offensive lineman more so. And a guy like Slater, who could play any position on that offensive line, really is an attractive piece for this team, especially with the injuries they have. I don't anticipate it being a wide receiver. And now when Carolina makes that trade to acquire Sam Darnold, they're not taking a quarterback at 8. They could take one of those guys, whether it's Devonta Smith or Jalen Waddle, that we thought might fall to the Eagles at 12. So that takes one of those guys out of the equation. I don't think any of them at this point might even be there at 12. So I would lean towards offensive line, then defensive line at number 12, if they stay there.
Interesting you say more likely that they move one way or the other. Well, we know what happens when you move. You can only go one of two ways, up or down. Give me a percentage breakout. Eagles moving up more likely. Eagles moving down more likely. Will they get a pick lesser than 12 or higher than 12? If Howie's going to play wheeler dealer, which way is he going?
I would lean like 60-40 down. And I look at Chicago at 20. I don't know that a quarterback can get there to 12. But if one of these guys does fall to 12, just to suppose that happens, because now Carolina's not in the market for a quarterback. We've heard different things about Justin Fields. I don't know what could happen. But if it transpires that maybe a team trades up to get another position player, if there is a possibility with a quarterback at 12, Eagles could trade down to 20 with the Bears and then accumulate one more first-round pick sometime in the future that they could potentially package in a blockbuster deal. So I would lean towards them more so trading down than trading up at this point.
But Rob, you do your obviously podcast with AP, cover the league as a whole as well. We know we're going to get quarterback. We know we're going to get quarterback 1, 2, 3 for the first time, for the third time in league history. There's a potential we could go 1, 2, 3, 4 for the first time. When does that fifth quarterback come off? Do you think it's going to be top 10? Do you think it's going to go that quickly when you're talking about Trevor Lawrence back?
Fifth quarterback. I think the fifth quarterback could be. We're looking at maybe in a top. Yeah, probably in a top 10 situation, guys.
Yeah. It's amazing.
You got to be looking at a top 10 situation there. For me, the question is when's the first non-quarterback going to go, right? And it does Atlanta at 4 really go with Kyle Pitts or someone else, or do they go with a quarterback? I don't think they go with a quarterback. I think they see in Matt Ryan a couple more years, and they probably go in a Kyle Pitts or someone else, and Sewell looking likely to go with the Bengals. But yeah, that 5 in the top 10, 5 quarterbacks in the top 10 is going to be, and how many of them are going to pan out, guys? That's the question. We look at the Sam Darnold, the Josh Rosen draft, and look at those guys now. And you go back to Winston and Mariota. You go back to Wentz and Goff. You look at all those. For as much as teams rely on getting the franchise quarterback in the top 5, top 10, it's not always panning out.
I'm going to give you a hypothetical. Both you guys, Rob, you specifically because you're the guest, but I want John's answer too. Both of you have leaned toward, it's in the Eagles' DNA to do the lines, to stay in the trenches, that they're going to go offensive line or defensive line. Well, for me, at number 12, nobody deserves. There isn't a defensive lineman in this draft that deserves to go in the top 12. So if that happens, I'm going to be ticked off. Offensive linemen, there are a couple that merit that type status. If Sewell doesn't go 5 to the Bengals, and we do see the 5 quarterbacks go off, and then there's the run on the receivers, both wide receivers and the tight end, and we get to 9 or 10, and oh, by the way, they haven't taken Sewell's name off the board just yet, is there a chance that they're going to move up? Rob, you just said you think there's more chance they're going to drop back. But if Sewell is only 2 or 3 picks from their grasp, but they get aggressive and go get him, or do they just sit and go, well, maybe you can drop all the way to 12? How do you think it's going to shake out? I'm not sure if we
lost Rob, so I'll jump in for him. But, that happened with Andre Dillard. That was the exact sort of thing that happened, and the fact that the Eagles really didn't even do their due diligence on Andre Dillard because they thought there was no way he was going to fall for him. All of a sudden, he starts to fall draft day, and they do that. They make the move up to get a player they thought there's no way he's going to be here. So could I see that happening with a player like Sewell specifically? He's the one guy I mentioned that. If he starts falling and all of a sudden he's there at 10, you say, oh, we better go up and get this guy. Yeah, I think that's a potential possibility. I don't think it's a possibility with the Kyle Pitts of the world or the Jamar Chases, and I think that's going to upset Eagles fans because, Jody, they wouldn't have moved back if they weren't comfortable with passing over those players.
The only problem with the Eagles moving up 10, and we're talking numbers here, and that's what we're thinking, but at some point you got to plug in the teams. Both the Cowboys and the Giants are the two teams that are sitting in front of the Eagles in the two picks right before them. So I don't know that either one of those teams is going to be ready, willing, and able to assist the Eagles in getting the best offensive lineman in the draft. It's probably going to have to be 9 or higher if the Eagles want to get their hands on Penei Sewell. All right, we will be talking draft for the next 3 weeks. That is a promise until we get there, until we reached draft night day one. We'll be speculating on it. Hopefully we get a trade every once in a while, like the Jets trading Sam Darnold to spike the interest a little bit. Johnny Mac, good show today. Appreciate your.
We got Rob back, so let's bring him back to say goodbye.
Okay, do we?
Xander, can we get him back? There we go. Rob's back.
I don't know what happened. It zapped out on me, guys.
It happens.
All right. Well, then let me ask you the question that I finish up the question I asked before you went into the Ethernet. Sure. If Penei Sewell comes down as far as number 9, if he doesn't get picked off before that, you mentioned you think Howie likes the deal. He's already done one deal. There's no reason he can't do another one. With that pick at number 12, you said more likely back than up. If Sewell comes down as far as 9, they go uber aggressive and go up and get him?
Especially with the Denver Broncos. Is Trey Lance off the board at that point? No, right? He's not off the board. They know that Dallas isn't going to take a quarterback. They know that the Giants aren't going to take a quarterback. That'd be a smart trade for the Denver Broncos. They ought to be hyping up Sewell right now in case that scenario does play out, so the Eagles jump up in there and snatch them. I think that there is a strong possibility of that happening. Fair enough. He's there, but I don't anticipate him being there.
Right, nor do I. But I just, that's the beauty of the lead up to the draft. You can make up these hypotheticals as you see fit to be able to put a guy on the spot. Rob, thanks for hopping on with us, brother. We appreciate it. We're going to hit you up plenty over the upcoming weeks leading up to the season, up to the draft, up to it all. Rob Maaddi, Associated Press, does some hosting over on 97.5, The Fanatic as well. All right, Johnny Mac, we'd be out of time. I look at my clock, says we have put our 2 hours in here on Eagle Birds 365. We will do the very same thing again tomorrow. Thanks to the guys on the stream for sending in their comments. It was WWE you're watching, right? We did confirm that earlier in the show.
We did confirm that. WrestleMania this weekend, which we'll get into at some point as well.
That's good. That sounds like a Friday topic here on Birds 365. He's John McMullen. I'm Jody McDonald. Thanks for streaming us, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow here on the JAKIB's Media YouTube channel.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.